Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of John Adams, and the focus is the most insignificant office. The year is 1788, and the Adamses had just returned from Europe, where John had been away for nearly a decade on diplomatic service for his country, both in France and in Britain. There's a grand reception in Boston as they arrive in Boston Harbor, and John enjoys the reception, but he's anxious to get to his new home that he purchased while he was away. It's a little bit broken down, a lot of work to do, but it was much bigger, and he felt he would need the space from what he had before, and he would call it PeaceFeel. That was the name of his new home in honor of the work that he did on behalf of peace, on behalf of his country. That would be his home for the rest of his life. Now, the big activity going on in the country at the time were the ratification conventions at the individual states for the new U.S. Constitution. The Constitution had been passed in the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia the year before, but now they needed at least 9 states to ratify to put it into effect. About the time that Adams returned, number 9 signed on. That was New Hampshire. They ratified, and the Constitution officially went into effect. Importantly, though, almost immediately thereafter, the 2 largest states, Virginia and New York, signed on as well. Now you've got 11 of the 13 said yes, including the biggest ones. It's time to put the Constitution into effect. That meant elections. Elections for members of Congress, both in the House and the Senate, and of course elections for the President and Vice President of the United States. Now, at the time, the Electoral College had just been introduced, and this was the means by which the president and the vice president would be elected. Each state was allocated electors, 1 each for every senator or representative in the legislature would be the number of electors that each state would have for president and vice president. Each elector would vote for 2 people. The top vote getter would be the president, the second would be the vice president. Now, most of the states did not use, in fact, the majority did not have any popular vote at all at the time. The state legislatures picked the electors to make the decision on their behalf. In those states that did use a popular vote, which was only about 2% of the total population, because it was restricted to wealthy white males, mostly landowners, a very small population actually decided the first president and vice president. Well, the first president was a foregone conclusion. That was going to be George Washington. In fact, in the Electoral College, it was unanimous. He got all 69 votes. The question, vice president? Well, 11 people got votes. John Adams got the most of those. He had 34, which was 1 short of a majority, but at the time that was actually sufficient to become the vice president. And of course, John Adams, knowing John Adams, he was insulted. Why didn't he get more votes? Why did so many other people get votes? This was his initial reaction to only getting the 34 to be runner-up to Washington. Well, he got over it. He heads to New York, the initial capital for the U.S., and he takes his seat, takes his oath of office, and takes his seat in the new government. What was that seat? Not in the executive branch. If you look at the Constitution, there really is no executive responsibility for the vice president, as long as the president is alive or doesn't resign. He does have a responsibility in the Constitution, and that is to be the president of the U.S. Senate. He presides over the Senate, but even that was very restricted. So first of all, Adams clearly recognizes something that's not really thought of today, but at the time, the office I hold is totally detached from the executive authority and confined to the legislative. It's really only been in the last 50 or so years that we've seen vice presidents become really involved in executive branch leadership, working hand in hand with the president. At the time, that was not in the Constitution. It was not Washington's interpretation. It was not Adams's interpretation. And he actually had very little role with the executive branch. Didn't go to cabinet meetings, was not involved in policy discussions. So his duties were limited specifically to being president of the Senate. Well, what did that mean? It meant mostly what he could not do, because the Constitution gives the House and Senate the ability to make their own rules, and the rules they made were the vice president, as president of the Senate, can't engage in debate, can't vote beyond the limit that he was given in the Constitution, which was to break tie votes. That's all he could do. He could preside, but he couldn't engage in debate, and he couldn't vote unless there was a tie. This was going to be really hard for John Adams. John Adams is a debater at heart. He engages, he agitates, he gives his opinion. This is what he has done his entire life, and now he's in a job where that is specifically precluded. Adams says at the time, "My country in its wisdom contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived." This was a tough 8 years for John Adams to sit in this role, but he was elected vice president, not once but twice, and he would certainly serve. He did get to exercise that tie-breaking responsibility actually more times than any other vice president except one. Number 2 in the all-time list of breaking 29 tie votes. So for those that thought that George Washington and his administration would sort of get whatever they wanted, well, the legislature was still split, and the legislature was not necessarily inclined to give the executive authority that the Constitution did not provide for us. So there was this check and balance thing going on. And so Adams, who certainly believed in a strong executive, 29 times was called to cast the tie-breaking vote. One of those, sort of an example of this, where the Constitution requires the advice and consent of the Senate on the nomination process for political appointees in the executive branch. But the Constitution is silent on what happens when the president, the executive, wants to fire one of those people, to get rid of them. Well, do they have to go back to the Senate to get advice and consent for a removal? That was the question. And again, the Constitution is silent. The Senate had said, this is something where we think we should have that authority. In fact, it's kind of implied. If we have to give the advice and consent to approve the position in the first place, we should also have the advice and consent for removal. Well, so they put together a law, and this was one of those that came to that tie vote that John Adams cast no. Now, Washington probably would have vetoed this one, but still, Adams got him off the hook. This is a topic that'll come up again later in U.S. history as this conflict of removals still became an issue later as the country progressed. One of the other things that Adams initiated, he was kind of ridiculed for, and probably rightfully so. Adams had felt that when he was in Europe, he got used to the fact that the royals had royal titles, exalted titles that would sort of represent their station in their country, and he felt the U.S. president should have something similar to that. He had suggested at first His Majesty the President, or maybe His Most Benign Highness. He was so serious about this, he had a Senate committee assigned to work on it, and the committee came up with His Highness the President of the United States and Protector of their Liberties. Imagine that title. Thomas Jefferson, who was already thinking that folks like Adams and Washington were becoming a little bit too monarchical for his taste, and this was an example of that, he called the whole thing the most superlatively ridiculous thing I ever heard of. And fortunately for the country, it was dropped. People, rational minds came together and said, you know what? This is a republic. This is different. This is not royalty. It's not hereditary. We're going to call our president Mr. President. Now, John Adams in this entire process picked up a nickname himself, probably not one he cared for very much. Senator Ralph Izard decided to offer the name Mr. Rotundity to Adams. Yeah, he was a bit big around the waist, and so playing with titles, he got tasked or labeled with one that kind of stuck for a while, probably not one he cared for very much. The other thing happening for Adams during his vice presidency was his ongoing relationship with Thomas Jefferson, which is very complicated. They were extremely close, almost brothers in arms for the respect and love they had for each other, primarily in their time in Europe, certainly going back to when they worked together on the Declaration of Independence, but then as diplomats for a number of years in Europe. It could not be closer. But politically, they were extremely different. Adams believing in the strong executive power and a strong federal government. Jefferson much more into sort of states' rights and individual liberty and individual sovereignty. And they become further and further separated politically. So they still saw each other socially. They still interacted, which was fine. But politically, they were going further and further apart. And an incident occurred that drew that wedge a little bit deeper. Jefferson had received a copy from Thomas Paine of his new book, The Rights of Man. So Paine had written before the Revolution, Common Sense, which was very popular, and writes very simple and straightforward kinds of thoughts, and Jefferson was very much enamored with his Rights of Man. And he wanted it published in the United States, and so he sent it off to a publisher with a note advocating why he thought the book should be published. Well, in that note, he noted about an increase in what he called political heresies going on in the country, which Paine addresses in The Rights of Man. By political heresies, he meant John Adams, and pretty much everybody knew it. And they all knew it when the publisher, without permission, decided to publish Jefferson's note along with the book. Now, Jefferson was mortified. Certainly, Adams was very embarrassed. It was an incredibly awkward time. Eventually, Jefferson decided to break the ice and send a note to Adams, not to apologize, but at least to sort of explain his remark. And Adams responded to Jefferson by saying, "It is high time that you and I should come to an explanation with each other. The friendship that has subsisted for 15 years between us without the smallest interruption, and until this occasion without the slightest suspicion, ever has been and still is very dear to my heart. There is no office which I would not resign rather than giving a just occasion to our friend to forsake me." This was a real heartfelt kinship that Adams and Jefferson felt for each other. And they're trying to hold on to it, but they're fracturing politically, and they're both central figures in the central government, prominent members of this founding generation. And these two things of their caring for each other, but their disconnect politically, are really coming to a head. 1796, we have another election. This is going to be the first contested election. George Washington is stepping down after 2 terms, and Adams and Jefferson, representing 2 very different factions in the country, are put forward as the 2 major candidates. It's very close in the Electoral College. Adams ekes out the victory, 71 to 68, just a 3-vote difference. It was 9 states for Adams, 7 states for Jefferson. So now we have this odd creation where John Adams, President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, the second leading vote getter, becomes vice president. He is politically opposed to almost everything that Adams believes in. And they would take a constitutional amendment to create the ticket process where presidents and vice presidents run together to kind of correct this, so we didn't have this ongoing case where the president and the vice president potentially coming from different political points of view. But that's what they were going to have to live with. John Adams is finally at the apex. After 2 decades in public service, he is now the executive. He's the man in charge. He is the President of the United States. And that is the story for another day. And that is John Adams and the most insignificant office from the life of John Adams. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.